Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us in today's live session, which will feature Guy Leluya and Nyakasikana, and we are going to be joined by Danai Madondo and Tendai Angela in the second half of this session. So just before we start, we just like to remember that today is actually the day that the Rana Plaza collapsed in Bangladesh, and that was 7 years ago. And we just like to commemorate all the garment workers that lost their lives and were injured in that major collapse. And we'd like to just continue to spread the word, and ask the brands who made our clothes, ask the brands what's in our clothes. Okay, sorry about that, guys. I just had a little bit of feedback coming in from YouTube, so we're going to start again. So anyway, I was saying that, we just want to remember the people that have made our clothes by asking the questions, who made our clothes, and asking the questions, what's in my clothes? And also just so that we can remember that loved clothes last. So it is so important for us as well as Fashion Revolution Zimbabwe to be hosting Julian and Halima in this session today, especially as they talk about their collaboration on the new philosophy of fashion. So in order for us to start, we're just going to hand over to Julian, and we're going to ask Julian to just walk us through his process and what the collaboration was about and how it came about.
Hello world, my name is Julian Temuka. I am the head of design for independent brand Guy Leluya. So as you can see, I've just set up slides here so you can see what is going on here. I would have liked to do this actually in the studio space that's inside the slides. It's just that unfortunately connection there is terrible. So I had to make a compromise, as we all have been doing given the current circumstances. Okay, so anyway, let me just start first with just what Galiluya is about. Galiluya is my agency of self in a sense. It's a manifestation of me overcoming my shortcomings and things that might not be so positive, and finding a way to manifest them with my best and my highest form of self-conception and my best projection of how I contribute to society at large. So this open studio opportunity was really something that sort of tied in with that whole philosophy, in the sense that it was an opportunity to look into investigating ideas of what's the highest form of creating. Fashion Revolution has who made my clothes, what's in my clothes. It's like, I really wasn't calling this sustainable fashion to begin with. I was just a guy who had very limited access to stuff, but with a great desire to just create. And so I just decided, you know what, whatever little I have now, I'm just going to start. So it really was born out of being crafty and a little bit cunning with the things that I had at my disposal to be able to create the highest form of self-expression, in my own opinion. And so when Fashion Revolution came along and proposed the idea of the open studio, it was very interesting because the more I found out about Fashion Revolution, the more it seemed like things I was doing had a lot of similarities to the concept of sustainability. So that's really where I began. And so the studio itself is really, for me, in a sense, not so much a place, but it's a conception. First, it's a philosophy, and it's a state of mind. And so you take that state of mind and that philosophy, and then you sort of let it inhabit the space that you're in. So because I had limited things, I had to work in temporary spaces. And so I had to figure out how to make things work. So what I really did was, as you can see in the images in front of you, I just, colonized the space. But it was colonizing in the sense that I only, kill what I eat, or eat what I kill, in a sense. So it's like, the only things that I populate the space with is things that are of necessity. That way I can keep track of things. I know where things are. And so whatever comes in, I know what it is. And therefore, knowing what it is, and being that there's not too many things piled on top of each other, it's easier for me to then be able to take that little that's in there and use it to try and, fashion something out of seemingly little resources. So if you see in the top right hand corner, there's a bunch of offcuts and dead stock fabrics. A lot of what I do is heavily dependent on dead stock fabrics that are really old. Some fabrics are 10 years old, sitting in warehouses. And basically, I just go and I fish for the source of things that align with the kind of theories I have about clothes. I like to stick a lot to staple items, because the idea of staple clothing is interesting in that it's a staple for a reason, and it's more likely to be used more often, and it's more likely to be of value and to stick around. And so that's where a lot of where I focus design um, my design approach on those sorts of garments. And so here, there you see in the bottom right hand corner is my beautiful Singer, my machine. It allows me to do quite a lot. I don't have many machines. I know people must have seen Mawson's open studio, and to see all these beautiful old machines, these rare machines. And at some point I would love to build a studio that is equipped, but um, really it's about necessity. So when it's necessary, it will happen. And so that's really the philosophy I try to run by. And yeah, that's the studio space. And the process was quite interesting. Becoming acquainted with Halima and what she's doing with Nyakasikana, and all the art-based initiatives she has in like engaging in social issues, especially in the ideas of inclusion of marginalized communities. It was very interesting because, in a sense, I had this idea that because I was not like a fully fledged design studio going crazy and commercial and uh, hyped up and everything, I kind of felt like I was kind of left out from European contemporary. So it was interesting to, engage with what Nyakasikana is doing, and to meet these kids who are, a lot of them are hearing impaired, and to exchange ideas, and to interrogate my perceptions of the idea of disadvantage. Because really what I learned was that um, when you break those barriers of perception, you find that people can contribute in all kinds of ways. And all those limitations that you claim are there, really it's about pushing through them, and taking it upon yourself to realize that it's your responsibility, just like sustainability. And sustainability was something I never really thought of um, as something I could market, or I could put into my work. Or so I never really thought about that direction. But the more I discovered what the case was um, in terms of sustainability, the more I discovered that as a maker, I have a great responsibility to take that upon myself and to implement that into my philosophy, and build a business, or build a design brand based on a philosophy that actually is looking towards creating future worlds in a more positive way, and looking ahead in a way that seeks to preserve and to promote the nature of the world in the most beautiful sense. And that meant that I had to really interrogate things like waste management, things like where am I getting my fabric from. And I mean, even now I'm still not perfect, but it's something that's developing a lot, especially in a forum like this where we get to have a conversation. So that's really the process. So now I really want to just talk about the garments before I start rambling and rambling and rambling. Let me just talk about the garments. So in front of you in the slide, you see there were four, we came up with four different garments really. So what the idea was to merge performing arts. Um, so Tamba Africa Circus, which is affiliated with Nyakasikana, they do a lot of, Halima will explain this a lot better than I will, but they do a lot of performance-based things, so including dance movements and motions and things like that. And it was very beautiful to interact with these kids and have them, they can't say the words, but they can make the gestures, so you ask them like, what do you think makes for a great performing garment or something? And they make motions like this. And so like it was about interpreting things like that, which was very interesting for me. So if you look at the first garment, I have it here. This is something I did in my first year at fashion school. Really, it's just a Mandarin cape. And what I did was I cut it at the shoulder seams to open it up. I left the front detail going on, and then I just reorientated it. So I kind of flipped it around, and I made a channel out of the hem, put in an elastic band to keep it nice and sturdy and useful for doing a lot of vigorous motion. And then I added a little press stud, and presto, there we have it. I really wanted to approach this with to make it as simple as possible so that it's not discouraging to want to take old clothing and turn it into something new. And yeah, that's really the idea. And our garment number two, this one is probably my favorite out of all of them. This is one of the first things I did after leaving school. The lady who I used to live with when I was at school gave me a bunch of charmeuse, like this really earthy brown, shimmery. And I just decided after a long time, let me do something with it. So this is what I decided to do with it. It's really beautiful jacket. I took a lot of time making it. And so what I did was, in order to make this garment useful, I didn't really want to ruin the integrity of it. It's a really beautiful jacket if you see it in real life. And so what I really did was, instead of ruining it by doing too much cutting and things, I was a little bit cheeky. So if you look in the image, there's 3 press studs forming at the bottom of that V. And so what I did was add those press studs to the natural hemline, and then you can invert it by turning it inside out and wear it that way. And so you'll see in an image I'll follow up with how that effect kind of changes the structure of the whole thing and sort of creates a new garment in a way, because I also wanted it to be able to turn back into that jacket and still be useful, so that it's something that has mileage. And number three and 4, I spliced the 2 of them together. So garment 3 was from my first collection after school. That's my little hand sewn tag. And so what I did was I took a shirt from that collection, and I sacrificed it for the cause, because I really wanted to be able to give Nyakasikana something that's I have put a lot of pride into, so that therefore I can also transfer that onto them and give them something that can work and last for years to come. And so I took off a sleeve just to keep as a memento, which I will use in another. I do a lot of that, like taking things apart and using them for other things. And so what I did here was I took the bottom of the 4th garment and I put it upside down, reorientated it onto the bottom of the hem of the shirt, so that it could have that effect of flounce here with this perma pleated voile. And so this was really in line with what the kids the Nyakasikana kids were really expressive about. So I really wanted to be able to meet that sort of expectation they had set for me. So it was really interesting to kind of feed into that challenge. And so that's that. And then this finally is the last one. This was a second year school project. As you can see now, it's incredibly cropped. I just cut off the bottom and put it onto the other one. So it's actually pretty interesting because then you can wear it over the third garment and have these incredibly long sleeves just to give a bit of character and personality to make it really fit that brief of a theatrical costume in a sense. And so those are the clothes. And here's just a little analysis on how I took them apart and the origins, etc., of the garments. And if you look into these images here, this is what they look like having been adulterated and transformed. And so I'm really happy at the way they turned out because they can be used. And at the same time, I find them beautiful. I don't know, I have this affinity for clothing that has a bit of mystery and character to it. And so I don't mind seeing creases, and I don't mind seeing some raw edges because I feel like that's the voice of time and process. And I love to express within the garment the work that has gone into it. And here's just a little bit more on. And this is what 3 and 4 look like when they're combined together. So I was really pleased with the way they came out, and I really hope Nyakasikana finds them useful in years to come.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that walkthrough, Julian. So now we're just going to go over to Halima, who is the curator and director for Tamba Africa and Nyakasikana. And I know on their agenda this year, they've been doing a lot of performances around climate change. And just through the process with them as well, you know, when we were talking about sustainability, we actually found that the performers came up with the meanings around what these words are. And I'm just going to ask Halima to go into a little bit more detail about the collaboration and also what the experience was like as they were feeding into the construction of these garments and as the students participated in the overall outcome.
All right, thanks, Rudo. Hi, everyone. My name is Halima. I am a cultural art curator, and I'm also the managing director for Tamba Africa Circus. So Tamba Africa is a social circus movement based here in Zimbabwe. We use theater, dance, music, and circus skills to inform, educate, empower young people on important social issues that affect them, especially those who live in marginalized or disenfranchised communities. So we've done a lot of different projects covering different social issues such as education, access for education to girls, and now we're working a lot on climate change, which is how we got involved with Fashion Open Studio and our collaboration with Hallelujah. So Nyakasikana itself is an all-female troupe that's under Tamba Africa Circus. And why we chose to do this particular collaboration with Nyakasikana instead of the entire circus troupe was because we really wanted to communicate climate justice for young women and girls, especially young women and girls living with disability. And for us, working with young people with disability has been an incredible experience because you get to look beyond what you know and to experience beyond what you think is actually available and accessible to you. So the depth that can come from this kind of collaboration with the fashion institution and our Nyakasikana troupe is something that really provides a unique insight into the issues of climate change and sustainability, you know, recycling, upcycling, etc. So speaking on the process with Hallelujah and Julian especially, it was very interesting to note when we started trying to communicate the idea of sustainability and recycling, because some of these words we take for granted. We don't realize that there are people in a lot of different communities that don't understand or don't have access to that sort of information. So we first had to dissect what we meant by, first of all, climate change and environmental degradation, and then like sift it down to sustainability and recycling and upcycling. and what the Open Studio was really about. So it was really exciting to see how they communicated with Julian in the process of designing or coming up with creative output for the garments themselves. And for our students, the ones we're working with for this particular collaboration are from Emerald Hill School of the Deaf. And it was very interesting to see how for them, the garments were not just something to adorn yourself or to accessorize with. It was a form of communication for them. They were very specific about what they would like to see on the garments because they wanted to communicate something through the movement. It wasn't so much about just performance and looking good. It was about if they're not using their hands to communicate and they're using their bodies, they want to still be able to have a language between themselves and the audience. So it was really mind-blowing to see the depth with which they absorbed the concept of recycling and upcycling and sustainability in the fashion industry. And for us, it was really interesting because we chose to be in fashion with this collaboration because it's something that's accessible to women and girls. Communicating about clothing is something that, irregardless of where you come from or who you are, we all have this clothing that we wear. And for us, we picked up on the word shelter because that's something that Guy Louis and Julian himself specifically really believed in, is this idea that our clothing is our personal shelter. And so we really absorbed that word and tried to transform it into something that we could communicate with people from all walks of life. And the experience for the students themselves, outside of it just being for the collaboration, was one of real empowerment, because I think they really felt like they had a voice and they had a right to use it, in the sense that they understood something that we may not understand. And I certainly didn't understand in terms of some of the perceptions that we have about sustainability. And they taught me more than I think we taught them. We learned to look beyond the physical, to kind of make it more than just about clothing, but about this idea of communication and how we are responsible to each other to make sure that we are all included in the process. And for us, inclusive arts is very important, but for them, it was them including us in something that we were not really privy to. So that exchange for the students and for us as the facilitators was a really, really powerful one. So I'm really glad that we had the chance to collaborate with Julian, and that Nyakasikana was a part of the story and this journey. And we're really looking forward to putting on the performance. It's unfortunate, with the current circumstances, we couldn't do the, but we're really excited in the future to be able to put it into practice, even though, already we have the tools and we can use those for other people as well.
Thank you, Halima. So you actually mentioned something that really stood out for me, and that was clothing as personal shelter. And I'd love for Julian just to go a little bit into how he incorporated this into his designs and how he believes that clothing can be our personal shelter and why clothing is shelter.
Well, it's that idea of clothing being the closest thing to your skin. It's like first you're naked, and then after that you're not in the house first, or you're not under the roof first. The first thing that's closest to you is the clothing. And whether it's protective clothing, whether it's aesthetic clothing, performance costume, medical wear, whatever it is, the purpose you're trying to live out is what the clothing conforms to. And so that idea of personal shelter is like, it's fundamental to clothing as fashion. And yes, I know we have the modish fashion, which is the cyclical idea of novelty, every so often as the system is. But the underlying thing within that is the philosophy of it being personal shelter. And so that idea really informs a lot of the way I approach design, because philosophically, I also like being a part of this with Nyakasikana and the idea of performing arts, because I revere art a lot. I revere a lot of the people who we used to see in the Renaissance, the De Medicis and all the artists that were a part of that age, and how they used art to shape their world with the values they saw as the highest things to aspire to. And so I really feel like that idea of personal shelter has that sort of thing embedded in it. It's something that as a foundation you can build on and begin to use art to build on top of the idea of personal shelter as just clothing in its useful form, and then apply the beauty of art in order to start to create a manifestation of the highest values we want to see, which in this case is really sustainability is no longer just some sort of fad or something that is a moral imperative to do because it's a good thing to do. It's like, no, are we going to have a future? And what is the future going to look like? Because we've learned now that a lot of the way we practice has a high price attached to it. We just spoke about Rana Plaza, and the idea of who makes my clothes is very important to me, which is why I take great pride in being able to have the hands and the mind to literally sit down and be the first person to fashion and make something. And so I like to apply that idea of art into it, because if I'm going to put something out there as a highest value, then I want to have that live through all dimensions of the clothing, which is really, this is really how I inform the way I produce and make.
Awesome, thank you. And then Halima, I'm also just going to ask you a question around how this shapes your performances as well, considering that the performance is coming after the clothes have been made. So the students are inputting into the design, but then they're also now formulating a performance, which we're all going to see, once we can go out into the world again. But how did you find this in the beginning? And how did you find this shaping the performance and, just the attitude to the performers and your new concept?
Well, for us, I think it was a blessing that we started the other way around, because normally with putting on a production or any performance, you start with the choreography, then you work your way into, figuring out the costume. But what was really a plus for us was starting with the communication in mind, with the end goal in mind. And so the process of making the clothes actually allowed us to think about, okay, but what movement do we need to have to communicate what the clothes are communicating? With our inclusive arts workshops especially, we focus more on expressive dance, and because we're working a lot with young children with hearing impairments, we really try and infuse parts of sign language into the movement. So having them find words to describe what we were trying to explain to them about climate change and about sustainability, they were able to create new words, which we were then able to translate into new movement. So in a sense, they've actually created a whole new dance style, I guess, if you want to call it that. So with Julie at first, and then work into the performance. And it also allowed us to think about, what we were going to call the performance, and we ended up calling it influencer, because we thought it's important that we become a new kind of influencer. We always pushing for our troop members and our workshop participants to be agents for social change for young people. And so we want them to influence others through this fashion performance. And hopefully when you see it afterwards, it will translate in that way. And you'll be able to just take a breath and slow down and understand the movement even without hearing a sound, which is where we're going with this particular piece. So yes, we have music for it, But what's more important for us is what you see and what you feel, because for the students themselves, they may not be able to hear the music, but they can feel it. So we're trying to communicate that as well through the performance. So ultimately, starting with the clothes was the best thing that could have happened for this collaboration. And we're really, really excited to be able to present a physical manifestation of the thought process that led to the action. Yeah.
Okay, great. And Julian, I've also just been taking a lot of notes. This is now going back into something you mentioned a little bit earlier about dead stock. So this is not a word that, you know, you hear a lot about, because I know most young designers go out actively looking for new fabric, but you are using dead stock. So I'd like to find out how you came across dead stock in Zim, and also how you're finding this is helping with your design process as well, and your making and manufacturing process.
Okay, well, coming across the dead stock was really it was kind of a happenstance. A lot of stuff that I do seems to be circumstantial. So I was really just curious. I had kind of been to all the places. You know, it's not as large as maybe people who are accustomed to the industry in Europe and such. And so, you know, it's not long before a maker discovers all the places. And so in searching for all these, for something new, I came across, you know, a warehouse where these guys said, oh no, this is dead stock. I didn't know the term. I was just looking for something to expand my range and give me more to be able to work with. And then they explained to me that it's very old fabrics that they would have sourced a while ago from rejected or no longer needed fabrics from Pakistan, India, from different places. And so I just went around the whole place looking at fabrics. And then ever since then, it was just a great place to go and get interesting fabrics at a really, 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 really low price, and be able to turn them into something beautiful and practical. And so that's really where it started. And then the process itself, yes, while it was circumstantial, at some point you start to realize that the more you waste or the more you misuse what you have, then you kind of take a hit, especially if you're like a really small, independent something like me, trying to build towards something of greater value and use to society at large. And so because of that, you start to become a lot more aware of and trying to figure out, so where does this come from? And if it comes from there, what happens in terms of it getting here? And who are the people involved? And you just naturally start to have an interest. And the more I also became acquainted with Fashion Revolution, the more it then became something I felt like maybe it's worth really going full throttle into this and not just having it be some sort of happenstance, but have it be a core philosophy to the way I approach design. And so that's really what's informed that.
Thank you, Julian. So now we're going to welcome Danai Madondo to the session. Unfortunately, Tendai Angela might not be able to join us today as she's actually caught in another session online, but we're going to welcome Danai to the session. And this would bring together the whole team that made up the therapy of fashion. And then I had an earlier session this week called One Garment, Many Hands. So we're going to include Danai into our conversation now. And we are going to start by asking Danai, how do you sustain your inner being and your ecosystem through clothing design?
In terms of how I sustain my mental well-being through fashion, I'm a creator. For me, creating is a space where I go to sort of like get away and come back to myself. So luckily for me, the industry that I found myself in is an industry that allows me to express myself. And being able to create for me is the ultimate therapy. Being able to use my hands is the ultimate therapy for me. So that's basically the way in which I sustain myself. I also use a lot of prayer. I'm a very spiritual person as well. So I take time to spend time alone and to be with myself, to meditate, to hear my own inner voice. And I think that's how I maintain my well-being in general.
Awesome. And then I'm also just going to ask Julian as well to tell us about how he sustains his well-being. So how do you sustain your well-being in your design process? How do you stay calm through all the things that are happening around?
This question is a lot more personal than most people know. In my second year at school, I had my first real manic episode, and I was subsequently diagnosed bipolar. So, I mean, I don't go around saying, "Yeah, look at me." But at the same time, it's very important to me because I know firsthand what emotional dysregulation and mental, instability does to your life in general. Your mind is everything. And so for me, part of the way I produce and the process is I like to start with the fundamentals. Start with something simple. The moment there's too much clutter, already my mind is in turmoil. And so I start with something simple, and I always allow my hands to sort of guide me, to always be curious, because if I allow a natural inclination or my instincts to sort of come into play, it also helps to keep my mind in a more stable sort of sense, and to really making as a therapy for me, because it's having that power, reclaiming that power, especially in my situation, reclaiming that power of my mind to be able to have a conception in my mind and manifest it out in a physical form. It's more powerful than I think I know how to explain.
I've also noticed with you, Julian, as well, that a lot of your finish is hand finish. Tell us about that process. You showed us your machine earlier on, but can you explain your process about working through your hands? I find it's the most beautiful thing. So could you also just walk us through why you've come to choose that in your journey in making?
I was fortunate enough when I started fashion school. My lecturers sort of picked up on my curiosity, and that I was always just I was very persistent with my curiosity, and so they sort of challenged me at first to sort of use my hands, try to be a little bit more tactful with the way I constructed garments. And ever since then, I got to love that because it was sort of a challenge for me. So, the one garment I was challenged not to show any top stitching on the garment. And so having accomplished that challenge was like a big deal for me. And I figured, oh, if I can do that, what more can I do? And so handwork just sort of came into it. And I think there's also that element of like African approach to crafts, where handwork is it's very much a widely used thing, and I really wanted to also emulate that. I mean, the label that I use on the clothing, I apply it by hand. I stitch it on. I keep it blank so that the identity of the person who is to own it, is embedded onto the garment, and I try to have as little to do with it after it's no longer something I made, and it's something for someone to use. And so that whole idea of being able to put that on, apply it by hand, was going back to that idea of something that's artistic in a sense, but at the same time is done with love and with care. I really like that idea of, if it's your personal shelter and it's the next thing to your skin, then and it's a label. A label is really like as a designer, it's like, oh, the label is like the most important thing because it's my identity and it's how I mark my work. And so that idea really sort of was multidimensional, and I really like to explore work with hand and machine. Also because sometimes I don't have something to produce a finish that I might ideally like, and so I compromise and I rework my ideas to fit the abilities that I have.
Awesome, thank you, Julian. So I'm going to ask everybody on the panel one last question before we close up for the day. And the last question, starting with Halima, is how has your mind shifted through this process, and what are you left pondering on after this whole entire exercise?
Well, thanks for putting me on the spot first. But I think throughout this process, my reasoning has changed. I think, I've been in the creative space for so long that you kind of have regular thinking patterns or creative patterns. But now with the work that I'm doing, especially working with people who are completely different to who I am, not just in ability, but also in experience, it's allowed me to kind of maybe rethink how I process certain things within my personal and creative life. So it's really given me an opportunity to stop and pause and readjust and find a way to explore things beyond what I think is there. I think oftentimes we're quite happy with what we see in front of us. The surface is quite great, especially if it's positive. But sometimes it's worth digging a little bit deeper, and it's worth speaking or being in places with people who would otherwise have a different way of seeing things. And I think that will probably take me into finding ways of allowing other people to have that experience as well. To answer the second part of your question, I think that's what's going to be more important for me, is how can I then empower other people, especially other people who wouldn't be in a position to have these kinds of opportunities like Fashion Open Studio, or just that creative outlets. How can I give them a platform, or give them a voice, or give them an opportunity to have this kind of experience themselves? So yeah.
Thank you, Halima. Over to you, Danai. Sorry, I think we've lost Danai there. So Julian, if you could just let us know how your mindset has shifted and what you're left pondering on now.
My mind shift is really that thing I mentioned earlier about breaking down your perceptions and sort of countering your implicit biases. If you don't understand something, that's not the same thing as that something is not worth understanding. So it's like I've really had a broadening of mind, which I now have to sort of fill up with a conscious interrogation, which I'm really happy about, because it's broadened my mind in a way that's everything that's good and everything that's useful, which is, if anything is useful, and good is a bonus, but usefulness is something in my personal situation that is it's imperative to keep around things that are useful and to try to minimize as many things that are frivolous and not so much important in the grand scheme of things. So that's really my mind shift, and I have a lot to think about. So I allow my mind to take its time and be kind to myself. Yeah.
Danai?
Hi, sorry, could you repeat the question again? If I catch it, I was on the floor.
It's okay. Okay, so Danai, we're just asking, how has your mind shifted throughout this process, and what are you left pondering on following this experience with the Open Studio and the Therapy of Fashion?
Well, I think I've learned so much from this whole experience. And honestly speaking, when I look at what I do fashion, I'm really reconsidering making a couple of changes after this. And like, it looks like I'm always making changes. It's not necessarily a change, but it's a gradual evolution. It's growth. I think as you move through life, as you're doing things, you grow, you evolve, you meet certain people that educate you. And for me, the fashion revolution journey has really been very educational. It's expanded the way in which I think. In terms of sustainability, I was looking at it from just a little minute angle. It's such a dynamic conversation. There's so many levels to it. And we're looking at percentages of how sustainable I am. I'll probably still say I'm 10%. I'm 10% sustainable, if I'm going to be very honest with you. I think there are levels to these things, and I think I still have a long way to go because of fully making my brand a sustainable brand. But in that as well, in terms of like as an individual, I've also started to look at the things around me with fresh eyes. And I'm hoping that people after, especially after our digital workshop, that they start to take better care of themselves, that they also start to see the things around them with fresh eyes, that they also start to see the ability of them being able to use their hands as a gift. And to make use of these things. You can make use of these things in your garden, you can make use of these things in your household. Like there's so many things that we can do with our hands. We can cook. All of these things are a form of therapy for us. So just finding a way in which we can utilize our hands, reconnect with ourselves, and when we do that, we are actually making the world a better place because then we can contribute to society in a better way.
Awesome, thank you. And I would just like to say thank you to all of you for opening my eyes up as well throughout this whole entire process. It's been the most amazing process to have been a part of and to have just watched evolving. I have also grown in that I'm left thinking, you know, what shifts am I going to make in my life after this? I keep breathing now and meditating, you know, where I used to just run around and be like, oh my gosh, there's so much chaos around me. But you guys have really, really been an amazing team. This has been an amazing collaboration. So I'd also just like to say thank you. Thank you for what you have taught us. Thank you for what you have left the world with. And on that note, we're just going to end this session and just also remind everyone that is tuned in that loved clothes last. Love your clothes, guys. They do last. Who made my clothes is the question that we're going to keep asking over and over again. So we do want to find out who made our clothes. And also now to go a little bit deeper in our conversation and start to find out what is actually in our clothes. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone who has tuned in. And thank you to this amazing team that has brought about the therapy of fashion. Thank you so much, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.